Welcome to In a Nutshell, the podcast dedicated to all things agricultural consulting. I'm Dylan Brush here with soil genius and ag consultant Bill Brush, and we're delighted to accompany you on this journey where we break down the different aspects of agricultural consulting. In each episode, we'll dive into the realm of agriculture through the eyes of Bill Brush, where consultants like Bill play a vital role in empowering farmers, agribusiness, and agricultural organizations. If you're passionate about agriculture, problem solving, and enjoy a little bit of detective work, this podcast is tailor-made for you.
Hello, everyone, and we're back for In a Nutshell. And what I'd like to talk about today is two essential nutrients that almost everybody looks at as negative. Like, I don't want any of that, even though the plant is required to have some of it. It's just that excesses create lots of problems, and so they're always viewed negatively. So first, we're going to talk about sodium. And people that have high sodium are always lamenting the damage it does and how it ruins soil structure. And a lot of times you need to know why it's building up and what level can I take and not have it do any damage to the plant. And and those people, I guess, that are fortunate out there in some places across the U.S., actually in some places have to add sodium because they need enough for, particularly in some of the grain crops, barley and wheat particularly, but back in the Midwest where they can have some problems where they won't produce without sodium. I think the situation is called take-all in wheat. And anyway, with that in mind, most of the time we're worried about excesses and how we get rid of them. So the first thing about sodium that I think you need to know is it's extremely important for how in plants, how it holds the cell wall turgor through the holding on to water. Everybody knows, if you eat too much sodium in your diet, you retain water. Well, that's what it does in the cells, but it needs that at a certain level. After that, it begins to be a problem because it'll hold on to more and more water. And I'll talk about a specific condition that we see quite a bit on sodium toxicity. But the next thing on sodium is understanding it's one of the four pillars of base saturation. Of course, its calcium is the highest, somewhere in that 65 to 75% range, and magnesium somewhere between 10 and 15. We like our potassium somewhere around 5 to 7.5, and we'd like our sodium somewhere around 1%. And so the rest of our other bases, our micronutrients, make up less than the total amount of sodium that we find in our soils. So sodium is very, very leachable. It really is. And one of the things that happens to us, we look at excess sodium sometimes and its problems, but it's not the culprit. It's excessive magnesium that actually is driving the retention of sodium. Basically, as it locks up pore space, it doesn't allow sodium to flow through those pore spaces and get out of that aerobic zone and get down deeper in the soil where it doesn't really create much of a problem. But that magnesium will basically tighten up that top 2 to 4 inches of soil, and all of a sudden the sodium will begin to hang out there. And I always like to say that the sodium is always going to hang out where there's maximum or excessive magnesium. And the more excessive it becomes, the more sodium that gets applied. And normally we'll talk about where's that sodium come from. And most of the time I'll talk about really exclusively, almost, it's coming from your water. Now, it's usually a byproduct of what was in that soil that got leached and over time got down into your groundwater. So if you are pumping water, you're basically pumping up and applying sodium onto that soil. And it doesn't take much of just a few parts per million, and all of a sudden you're putting on pounds and later thousands of pounds, if you're not careful, of sodium every year. So it's imperative that you get that soil, in shape so that you can remove that sodium through normal leaching. And we'll talk a little bit about what it likes to pair with when we get the chloride. But you need to have that soil opened up. If not, you will build sodium up, and you need water. You can't grow any crop without water, so you'll need to add that. So you'll need to make sure that calcium gets to that number, increase the pore space as I talk, let the microbiology thrive, and then be able to move sodium out of that aerobic zone, and everything will work better. One of the things also when you're talking about, opening things up to that aerobic zone is that it will always be a certain amount there, but when you're adding sodium every year through your irrigation well, it's going to be a long-term problem. So this is one you really need to understand how to do it. As opposed to, I'm normally a rainfall guy. I get almost all my water through rainfall, which we see literally almost no, if not zero amount of sodium come from rainfall. Well, guess what? It's not an issue. But when you maybe apply 10% of your water through your well, and between the rainfall and that well, you really don't build it up to toxic levels. Most of the really toxic sodium levels are high magnesium, and you're applying a lot through your water. And it's, so again, you've heard me, if you've listened to my other podcasts, talk about you got to measure. You have to measure. So I need to know what's in my soil, but I also need to know how much is in my water. And then I can do simple calculations to find out how many pounds I'm applying to my soil per acre every year. And it's between that so that you know how you can move sodium through that soil quicker. And one of the things that we talked about, sulfur being able to move magnesium out. It can also help move sodium out. If we get magnesium down to where it needs to be, it'll also help move sodium out. There's an interesting condition that I've seen a lot in California where most of what we farm, we see a lot of low potassium soils. One reason is that we harvest a lot of crops that are high removal rates of potassium, is one part of that. And the other is just the simple cost of how much it is to buy potassium at levels to keep those potassium levels up in that 5 to 7.5%. So one of the things that happens with our high sodic soils or high sodic water that we're applying to this, we find that our potassium levels begin to slip down to 3%, 2%, and our sodiums begin to get above 3-4%, 4%. And so what you're getting is you have more base saturation of sodium than you do potassium. And when you look at a periodic table, you'll see they're very, very similar in types. The sodium and the potassium are almost identical in how the plant looks at both of them. So whatever's in the greatest quantity or the greatest percentage is what the plant takes up. And that plant takes up that sodium in preference to potassium just because there's more there. But as it distributes it throughout the plant, one of the really major functions there are many for potassium, but one of its functions is to be placed in the guard cells in several components, but in the guard cells. And so what it does is it opens and closes the stomata to allow water in times of heat to move out and also carbon dioxide to flow in. Well, one of the problems when sodium gets placed in those guard cells where normally you would have potassium, it's not able to perform that same function. So what happens is it just is closed, which means guess what? Water cannot move out, cannot cool the surface down. And because the plant is trying to pump water up to cool itself off, the sodium is retaining it. And what it does is it keeps holding on to water until it begins to burst, which is what that distinctive sodium burn line around the tips and edges. And that is what we see, and it's strictly because we have greater amounts of sodium in that base saturation than we have potassium. Something to really watch closely for in a soil test, and then react to it and making sure we can get as much sodium leached through and apply the proper amounts of potassium to keep us above that level. So that's enough about sodium, I think, for now. I want to talk to its partner, chloride. And the reason I say that is a lot of people don't know a lot of chemistry, but several things they know is one is H2O, and a lot of them is sodium chloride, NaCl, basically pure table salt. Okay. And the thing about sodium chloride, it likes to go together in a bond, and it likes to be very soluble, and it likes to be bonded up when it dries out. So if you want to see that reaction, it's very simple. Get a small glass of water and put enough salt in so that it reaches not saturation, but it's dissolved and it's into solution. And at that point, let it sit and evaporate. So what you've done is you've disassociated sodium from chloride in the water, and now it's suspended. But as soon as it basically evaporates, it goes back together as sodium chloride. And you'll see that by the white. If it was crystalline, you'll see it's more powdery because it went back in small amounts. In a lot of cases, this is what happens in your soil. And so sodium likes to pair up with chloride and move through. Chloride is very essential also in several functions of the plant, but one of the things is that it's very, very high, I should say, a high conductivity to move nutrients in and out of plants. So it really increases what we call the EC. Problem is it can increase that EC so that we get too much flow of nutrients, too much flow of electrons, and you can literally electrocute it because it is so electroconductive that it will do that. So you have to be very careful with chloride. Very rarely do we find that we have much of a problem with chlorides unless, again, we have these high sodium chloride substances in your water and you're trying to apply them out. Again, as I was talking about, very, very leachable, very, very dissolvable to move them throughout. But when you don't, you'll get into a lot of these toxic reasons by having a EC that becomes too high. And it doesn't have to be very high for chlorine to be toxic. And a lot of people will say, where can I get chloride coming from? I don't have any in my water. Well, another place you can get them kind of by accident is by using muriate of potash or potassium chloride. And that, KCl as we like to call it, that's a place you can be applying chloride. If that's all you apply and you get good leaching, you probably won't see an issue. But if you've got sodium with it and chloride and you're applying KCl, now you're just increasing the amount of chloride. And one of the things that we notice in chloride, and it's easy to understand, the analogy I like to look at is it basically is detrimental to microbiology. Molds, yeast, fungi. Just think of a swimming pool. What do we add? We add chlorine or chloride. Okay? It's very, very detrimental. So when we have high amounts of chloride into our soil, not only is it toxic to the plants and can burn those plants and roots from having a high EC, they can slow down the microbiology. And it's very important, as I've explained on previous podcasts, it's all about the microbiology to get plants to be healthy and grow properly. That, I'm going to call it quits for sodium chloride. Don't be afraid of them. The plants need them. But be careful where they come from. Where can I not put them on if I'm worried about there being an excess? And what can I do with my sodium chloride in my water? And that's one of the main reasons, is to keep that soil opened up and very porous. And most of your sodium problems will probably go away. So until next time.
Thank you for another absolutely stellar episode of Agriculture in a Nutshell, Bill. I'm sure that all of our listeners very much so enjoyed what you had to say about sodium and chloride. Be sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe, and stay tuned for episodes every other week. And most importantly, always stay curious.